Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Welcome to Lunch with Books. My name is Sean. Nice to meet you. If you would be so kind, please silence your cell phones at this time. If you'd like to be on our mailing list, the box is over there. Fill out the form. We'll get you on the list so that you know about upcoming programs. It is Glass Month, as I mentioned last week. And so we have the exhibit upstairs, if you haven't seen it yet. We also, we're raffling off a piece that was made by a local artisan from a window from a local church. It's a very nice piece. And all you have to do is fill out a little ticket with your name and number and put it in the box that's over there. And it's usually upstairs, but it's over there today. One entry per person. If you enter more than once, you will be eliminated. So only enter once. This Thursday, 2 days from now, special edition Lunch with Books. Mr. Greg Geikus, did he leave? Is he here? Yeah. He was here. He'll be back on Thursday with his model of the Titanic, which is 52 inches long, scale model that he made from scraps, basically. But it's amazing, and he'll bring his model of the USS West Virginia as well. So he'll tell you all about the Titanic, which of course sank this month. What was it, 1912? Yeah. Yes. They'll be both down here. So that'll be Thursday at noon. Next Tuesday, Warwood man, Dr. Charles Douche, who's also a historian with the Air Force and serves on the Eberly Colleges of Arts and Sciences Visiting Committee at WVU. He's a founding member of U.S. Space Force History and Heritage Program, and he's a former command historian of the U.S. Air Force. Do not mind that lighting. It goes in and out. We can't fix it. We're working on it. His new book is called Balloon Ace, The Life of an Early Air Power Visionary, which is about Louis Bennett Jr. So that'll be next Tuesday, tax day, 15th at noon. The gentleman who will be speaking today first spoke here 15 years ago. And I know that because I was also here 15 years ago. But he spoke at that time about the Ballad of Trenchmouth Taggart, which is an excellent novel, as are all his novels. But I'm going to bring up our special guest to introduce our guest today. Let's bring up the West Virginia Poet Laureate, Mark Harshman.
Thanks, Sean, and as always, a tip of the hat to the Ohio County Public Library, surely the finest public library in the state of West Virginia. The programming that we get to have here because of Sean and the whole staff at the library is just phenomenal, and it's always a pleasure to be playing a small part in all that. And it's my pleasure to introduce Glenn Taylor today. Glenn's fourth novel, The Songs of Betty Page. University of Massachusetts won the 2023 Juniper Prize in Fiction. This is a big deal. His first novel, already mentioned, The Ballad of Trenchmouth Taggart, was a finalist for the 2008 National Book Critics Circle Award, also a huge big deal. His second novel, about which I think you'll hear the most today, The Marrowbone Marble Factory, was published by HarperCollins, about which the Chicago Tribune said it unfolds like old-time prophecy, full of fire and portent. I want somebody to write that about one of my poems. About his third novel, A Hanging at Cinderbottom, published by the prestigious Tin House publishing group, the New York Times Book Review wrote, in part, what makes this book a bone-through, can't-quit-you craving is Taylor's preternatural gift for language. That's pretty high praise, too. His work has appeared in other magazines and journals, such as the Oxford American, The Guardian, Gulf Coast, and others. Born and raised in Huntington, whose family home I saw this weekend. That's a story for a little bit later, Glenn. He now resides with his family in Morgantown, where he is at work on a new novel. Let me give you just a taste of the kind of detail of evocative language that Glenn is a master of from the Marrowbone novel. Above the chapel door hung a sign. It was a 4-foot length of broken siding, painted white and strung on roofing nails. Staples had found the wood in the scrap pile reserved for campfires, and the heavy gauge wire had been left at the foot of an electrician's ladder. He'd finger painted on the white sign the words that came to him one day while perched atop the chapel roof, beholding his surroundings, and he'd spoken them on the air. Land of Canaan Congregational, the sign read. Don't you want to read that novel just for those words? The Seattle Post-Intelligencer wrote about the Marrowbone Marble Factory. For a book to speak of human truths and yet be superbly readable moves it to the level of a classic. To have with us today the author of what not only is but must remain a classic in American literature, it's a true honor. Please, a warm welcome for Glenn Taylor.
Well, thank you all so much for having me. And thanks to Sean and to Mark, who I just have to say is one of the most delightful people I've ever met. And every time I see him, I feel like I'm the one who's being honored. So to have you introduce me today is really quite something. Anyone who knows me knows, and I'll mention it in my talk probably, that my favorite writer of all time, kind of have 2 or 3, but in my top 3 is Louise McNeill. And so to have Louise McNeill having been the poet laureate of the state for so long, you can imagine what it means to me to be introduced by the poet laureate of the state. It's just amazing. And maybe don't tell anybody at the Cabell County Public Library or anybody in the greater Huntington area, but I think I might have to agree with what Mark said about the best library in the state. There's something about it, not just the programming, which is phenomenal, as Mark said, but also just when you walk in, upstairs you just walk in and you've got the murals and it's so well organized and it's relatively quiet and nobody's giving you the evil eye, sitting behind a computer and yeah, friendly place, very friendly place. And so I'm delighted to be here. Both at this library, once again, I'll mention that in my talk too, as Sean said, it's been 15 years. But even just to be back in Wheeling, which I don't know if other people say this, but a lot of times Wheeling reminds me a great deal in some certain ways, infrastructure, buildings, river of Huntington. I know they're very different in several ways. This is not the Ohio River Valley necessarily like we have, but they're very similar towns. With very similar histories and faiths, and so I feel quite at home here, and I thank you for having me. Well, thanks. And to be standing right here in the same room, it does really bring back fond memories of my first time doing Lunch with Books, which, as I mentioned and Sean mentioned, was a mind-boggling 15 years ago. At that time, I was doing the Hughes Lecture Series at West Liberty, which was also an incredible experience. And so I got to be double booked here at the library during my stay. And I guess to me, one of the funny things to think about is just to think back about that time, 2010, I think it was roughly 2010. I was still living in Chicago, Illinois at that time, and my children were little, I have 3 children, they were all little. They're certainly not little now. But it's funny to think of all of us living in Chicago, and we had been living there for nearly a decade at that point, all 3 of the children having been born in the greater Chicago area. And the reason I say that's odd to think about now is because we've been back in West Virginia, specifically Morgantown, since 2011. And so I think of my children as having never lived anywhere else. You see these kids now, you're like, you were born in Chicago, but I will note that my youngest, who I just spoke to Mark about because I just had him up here in Triadelphia at the wonderful Highlands Sports Complex for a basketball tournament. My youngest is a baller, and he's 6'2" at 15 years old. But we were up here for a basketball tournament, and I'll note that when people ask where he's from, especially at things like a basketball tournament, he's been known to say Chicago. Even though he was a whopping 1 year old when we moved back home to West Virginia. So at any rate, maybe today it's fitting to begin with where we've lived, and more pointedly where one is born, because to really consider my first life experiences involving glass made in West Virginia, I did a little reflecting before today, and I guess I need only to think of my own early youth and growing up in Huntington, specifically right up the hill from Four Pole Creek, and a short walk to 5th Street West. And if you kept walking west on 5th Street West, you'd hit Owens, Illinois, a massive glass factory, one of a handful in the U.S., one that outproduced its counterparts in places like Oakland, California at one point in terms of products such as wide-mouth baby food jars. And the reason I say that I only need to look at my childhood in Four Pole Creek is that what this meant for me as a kid is this. In the summer, my friends and I would go down to Four Pole Creek, toting our buckets, and we'd go crawdad hunting. Don't ask me why. It's not like we were living on the bayou and having steamed crawfish every night, but we still did it. And on one of these excursions, something caught my eye, something shimmering and stuck in the mud of the creek bank. It was this, obviously, and I will pass it around, and you can feel it. I still love the feel of it to this day. And obviously, to my grown self, this is a cast-off from the factory up the street. But, as you can imagine, to my 8-year-old self, this was a full-blown, real mega diamond, I mean, it was like a jewel of movie proportions, I can't remember what was out at the time, but probably like The Rescuers or, Romancing the Stone or something. When I saw this thing poking its head out of the mud, I was like, oh my God, And for years, I thought of it like a giant mega diamond. And I've kept it ever since, and I keep it on my writing desk, and I pick it up and I feel it. And so that's kind of how in reflecting, as I said, on today, that's my first real, initiation with glass made in our state. And even though I lived, like I said, just a 5-minute walk from Owens, Illinois, I hadn't really considered it until it was in my hand. So, for what it's worth, I'll send this around. It's obviously very rough and rudimentary, and one thing I learned as a teacher is always know for sure that one of your students in your class knows a hell of a lot more than you do about what you're trying to teach them. So I know that many of you here today know a hell of a lot more than I do about glass. And so knowing that and knowing you might not be real impressed with a cast-off like that, I'll send it around anyway. And it goes without saying that many of you in this room know a lot more about the time period of this book than I do, because of course I was born in 1975. This book takes place between the years 1941 and 1968. So I had to do a heck of a lot of research, not only on glass, but on a lot of other things. I hope to cover some of those things today. I suppose the beginning stages of writing what would become the Marrowbone Marble Company that Mark referred to, such childhood experiences, as I just mentioned at Four Pole Creek, bubbled to the surface, and I began to handle that hunk of glass that you're handling right now again. And I began to think of the factory that ran hard every day when I was a kid, that employed, I believe, over 1,500 people at one point, and that was, like so many other things in our state, shut down in the years following my departure from Huntington for college. Owens, Illinois, in my book, became the Mann Glass Company. That's M-A-N-N. And here I must side note the meaning behind that name for me. It was my, I wasn't going to use the real name. This is fiction. This is a novel. You get to take liberties, so I wasn't going to plug in Owens. And so I called it the Mann Glass Company, M-A-N-N. And what that was my little secret side tribute to Opal Mann. And I don't know if anyone has ever heard of Opal Mann, but she was a woman who started working on the selecting line, the layer, as they called it, at Owens, Illinois. She was a selector starting in 1931. And later, her landmark case against the factory for its gender discrimination practices resulted in so much good change in terms of equal rights in the workplace. In other words, it lasted 3 years, this suit that she filed, because there were some real discriminatory practices going on at Owens at the time. And not just at the factory itself, but also the union. The Local 256 was no women allowed at the time. And so she filed a lawsuit. It went all the way to the Supreme Court, and she won. And it kind of came on the heels of 1964 and all the great legislation being passed at that time in terms of equal rights and civil liberties. And so it's a pretty major thing. And so I thought, you know what? I'm going to name my glass factory after Opal Mann. And I might get to that research today. I brought a printout of a scholarly paper written by a Marshall student in the 90s, I believe, called The Legend of Opal Mann. And there are some great oral histories where she's interviewed before she passed on. And so I guess, in terms of mentioning her, I'll just give you a little preface that we may circle back to before we get into glass, and that is that in the end, the fight for equal rights is really what the Marrowbone Marble Company is about. Like I said, something we might come back to more fully later. And the factory itself was therefore a logical place to start, as my young protagonist, a young man named Loyal Ledford, rises up the ranks at the Mann Glass Company after coming home from combat in World War II. And while that's happening, his friend, his black co-worker, Mac Wells, another veteran of the war who's just returned, does not get to rise up those same ranks. Just as black soldiers returning from Europe and the Pacific did not receive the celebratory welcome that a young man like my main character, Loyal Ledford, received, and neither did they receive equal employment opportunity nor an equal shot at housing. So behind all the glass stuff early in the book is really this idea of human rights, I think, in the book. And so maybe a little more than on the context surrounding this novel's origins. And they're messy, so bear with me. For me, the writing process, we hear that term a lot, the writing process, and I don't know how interested you folks are in hearing about that process, but maybe a little bit. Mine's always messy, it's all over the place. And so my interests are many. And so if I look back to when I started writing this novel, around about 2007, let's say, my interest in the realities surrounding war and the young men we send off to fight wars was twofold. One, I was reading Studs Terkel's book, The Good War, at the time, and I don't know if anyone is familiar with Studs Terkel or that book, but it's an oral history book of World War II in which veterans spoke on, among other things, how and why they had come to enlist. And so, this was a book of my dad's that we'd be visiting my parents in Huntington, and he'd have books lying around. This is how I mostly did my research for all my novel writing. My dad's a big reader of history, and he had Studs Terkel's book, The Good War, and so I picked it up. And what I realized in these oral histories of how and why these young men had come to enlist was that so often they were 18, 19 years old, and had been profoundly affected by the attack on Pearl Harbor. Well, the reason I say it's twofold is it wasn't just my reading of a book like that. Imagine at the time I've got my first real teaching job out of graduate school, and I was teaching at a big community college in northwest suburban Chicago, and increasingly there were young men and women enrolled in my English 101 classes who were just returning from multiple tours of duty in Iraq or Afghanistan. And, this was really something to note. And so I once had one of these students in in my office during office hours, and I asked him. He was a very bright young man named Colin. I'll never forget him. And he was writing his personal essay about his experiences. He had done 3 tours of duty, and I said, if you don't mind me asking, Colin, I'm interested, what made you enlist? And he told me that he'd graduated high school in May of 2001, and that he had enlisted on September 12th, 2001. And obviously you can figure why. So here I am reading this book of Studs Terkel's called The Good War, about all these young men who, immediately in the days following the attack on Pearl Harbor, up and enlisted. And I'm seeing in my lived life the same thing. After the September 11th attack, all these young people just up and enlisting. And so I began to see a direct line between 1941 and 2001. I began to realize how many young people simply suited up and went off to war in places they'd never heard of. And so I wrote about a young glass factory worker, Loyal Ledford, who did just that. And then I wrote about what it was like for him to go back to work at the same factory after having been changed by war, and what it was like for his friend Mac Wells, too, who I mentioned before. And it was in this what it was like, if you will, that there grew a seed, an idea that the world of fiction would allow me to grow. What if Loyal Ledford and his friend Mac Wells decided to hell with the glass factory, to hell with post-war discriminatory rat race, let's move out to this acreage in the country and start making marbles. And so that's what I did. But before we turn truly to marbles, let's stop a moment and hear just a couple short passages from very early in the novel, passages that take place inside the Man Glass Factory. Words and worlds I was only able to conjure after a great deal of research into the history and workings of the real Owens plant down the street from where I grew up. So, first, right at the very beginning of the book, Chapter 1, October 1941. 6 brick chimney stacks stood at 100 feet each. This was the Man Glass Company, a 10-acre factory tract straddling the C&O line at Huntington's western edge. Machine-made wide and narrow-mouth bottles had been blown inside since 1915, and later prescription and proprietary bottles. Eli Mann had opened the doors of a hand-blown specialty shop here in 1908. Now, at 90, he owned a factory with 1,000 employees and 2 300-ton furnaces. Inside, Loyal Ledford worked the swing shift, 4 to midnight. He'd done so since graduating high school in June, and before him, his father had done the same. Ledford was a long, sturdy young man with big hands. At 13, he was a Man Glass batch boy. At 18, he bid on and got his job as a furnace tender. It suited him. He was careful to respect the fire, as heat will sometimes break even a young man down. Inside a glass factory, a furnace roared at 3,000 degrees. Ledford squinted hard, checked the gauge, and eyeballed the furnace fire one last time through the barrier window. As was his custom at the end of a shift, Ledford stared at the fire until his peripherals went white. Then he closed his eyes and watched the little swirls dance across the black stage of his eyelids. He pushed his scoop shovel into the corner with his boot tip and walked blind down the dark east aisle. The wall bulbs had surged again, popped open like fireworks, muted by the rest of the racket inside. Ledford clocked off at a minute past midnight. Saturday turned into Sunday, and Ledford sat alone in the dark in front of his work locker. The sweat sheen on his body dried up. His wet collared shirt turned cold and stuck to him. He coughed, pulled off his split leather work gloves. They rode high, all the way to the elbows. And later, we hear this. This is November 1941, so you can see what we're leading to in December 1941. Ledford liked glass, especially in its molten form. To watch the stuff glow and channel outward from a 300-ton pot was a sight. He'd once watched his father, a real free blower, puff up and shape that very material, and he remembered what he'd been told. Glass ain't nothing but the earth under your brogans, boy. As his father had said this, he gripped his blowpipe in one hand and his punny rod in the other. He set them aside and scored a hot green ashtray with his dog-leg jackknife. There is sand, limestone, and ash, he'd said. Back in front of the furnace, Ledford watched the gauge needle blur and wobble. He smacked himself to stay alert. Late nights were catching up to him. There was a sting at the base of his neck. He turned to find Lucius Ball before him in black safety goggles. "You want little babies to starve?" Lucius asked. Spittle flew, landed on Ledford's cheek where the heat evaporated it. "How's that?" "Baby food jars. Isn't that what we make here, son?" Sweat ran from the crease of Lucius's double chin, and his hair tonic smelled sour. "I reckon it's one of the things we make, Mr. Ball. You can bet your last bits on that, boy. And if the fire isn't tended right, then we don't stay on top of that quota board, do we, son?" Lucius Ball liked to ask questions and not wait for answers. "This plant outproduces Los Angeles and Oakland. Did you know that? Did you know we outproduce Waco, Texas? I bet you didn't. I bet you take your eyes off the fire just as regular as you please." So that passage is a little taste of the reality of working the swing shift and having a boss who's not real friendly to your work. Now, this next little passage probably comes from the inspiration of Opal Mann, who I told you about. So women were not often hired, black folks and women were not often hired at Owens, and when women were hired, they were put on the selecting line to get the stuff off the conveyor belt that wasn't right and throw it away, and it was very little pay. And so here we have Mac Wells's wife, Lizzie, working on Mac was the janitor at the Mann Glass Company in my book, and his wife Lizzie got a job there because of him having a job there, and she's on the selecting line. Selecting was bad work. It was liable to strain the eyes watching all those little glass jars come by on the belt, and it was loud, always loud. Lizzie Wells, like all the other women on the lair, sometimes found her eyes jumping left to right long after work was done. She checked her wristwatch, almost 6 a.m. She reached down and discarded a faulty medicine dropper. Across the room, Faye had a sneezing fit. She was the oily-haired one everybody said was crazy. When her sneezing subsided, Faye stood still for a moment, shoulders sagged. Lizzie noticed the tag at her collar was up, a little white square at the base of her neck. Then Faye shot out her arm and picked up a misshapen baby food jar. She reared back and threw it across the room. A couple women ducked the shattering ricochet. "Nobody can't do this type of thing for 50 cents an hour," Faye hollered. "No man would stand for it." Somebody told her to shut her mouth. Otherwise, none spoke a word. There was just the metal hum of conveyance. So I thought I should give, a little, before we talk about marbles and playing ringer and shooter marbles and fun things like that, I think it's important to note the reality of that kind of factory work at that time, and who got what jobs. And so, I need to mention, and I think I'll even send this around, because this was my most fascinating source in terms of finding out how, as I mentioned before, I have no idea about any of this stuff. Didn't live at the time, was not a glass man. And so the best piece of research that I was able to find was from the Kentucky, Ohio, West Virginia Historical Society, housed in a little tiny church basement on Huntington's West End. And I was in Chicago at the time, so my dad went and picked it up for me and sent it to me. I've already got it up here. I'm going to send it around. It is called Calling to Memory, The History of the Owens, Illinois, Huntington, West Virginia Plant Number 2. And it is, this comb-bound, pictures, newspaper clippings, newsletters that talk about the company's softball team, and people's birthdays. It's just an amazing piece of history. So you might not be interested. Feel free to just pass it on, but in case you want to flip through something while I'm talking, get sick of hearing me yap away up here, you got a little visual aid. which, a quick aside, in case I forgot to say this in my thank yous at the beginning, my biggest thank you should be to you all for being here, because otherwise I'd just be up here talking to myself, and that doesn't do anybody that doesn't do anybody any good. So I certainly am thankful that you're here. Okay, so I'm sending that around. Now, I think enough of that, onward to marbles. And if we again look at young, loyal Ledford, now changed by war and irritated by factory work upon his return, yearning for something new and real, we wonder how he came to the idea for what would become the Marrowbone Marble Company. Well, he was haunted nightly by combat dreams, as you are. However, one night he had a dream that was different. It was peaceful, and in it, a voice told him something, and it was 2 words, and those words were, "Make marbles." And so that's what he did. And here, again, I mentioned the writing process. I think I should mention the origin of such a dream and such a plot twist in my book. I'd picked up a used book around the time I was writing my own book, and I was stuck. Oftentimes I find, and I think other novelists do too, that about a third of the way through your first draft of your book, you just hit a wall. And so when that happens to me, I go to bookstores and I start reading. Some writers don't read while they write books. I am not one of those writers. And so I found used this big hardcover, and I didn't bring it with me because it's unwieldy. I took a picture instead. And it is called The Penguin Dictionary of American Folklore. So if I may look at my picture that I took for today. It's a wonderful book, and I opened to the very first entry because the whole thing is laid out in alphabetical order, as dictionaries are. So again, the Penguin Dictionary of American Folklore. And here's what I read. The very first entry is Aaron, Jesse. So Jesse Aaron is who it's about, and the name, of course, is spelled A-A-R-O-N, thus being the first entry. And here's what it says. 1887 to 1979. Jesse Aaron was an African-American folk sculptor who worked mainly with discarded wood, to which he added other found objects. Born in Lake City, Florida, Aaron was a professional cook until he was over 70 years old. At that time, his wife was temporarily blinded by cataracts, and Aaron stayed home to care for her. He opened a nursery on his modest property near Gainesville, Florida, but had to sell the business to pay for the operation that restored his wife's sight in 1968. Thankful, but out of work for the first time in his life, Aaron prayed to God to reveal a suitable occupation. Aaron reported that at 3 o'clock on the morning of July 5th, 1968, a spirit awakened him with the words, "Carve wood." Aaron immediately rose out of bed and began carving some scrap oak. Aaron carved from that time until his death in 1979 at age 92. And he is now the first entry in the Penguin Dictionary of American Folklore. And so, here I was stuck, and I thought, hey, carve wood, make marbles. I almost had that voice from Field of Dreams, like, if you build it, they will come. It was kind of that kind of thing, and I thought, what the hell, let's do it. And I think it's fitting because this was kind of a pie-in-the-sky idea, for these 2 young veterans, one, with young families, wives and children, one black, one white, to say, to hell with the factory, let's move out on this property that was in Ledford's family and start a one-furnace marble factory. So for me, at least, writing often comes this way. It's not so much focused, driven, sought-out research, but a different variety, a coincidental, found, accidentally discovered research. That's what I find the most joy in. So Ledford has his dream, and he goes on to make it happen. Now, I found that I had to contend with the fact that I didn't know the world of marbles, much less marble making. I did not grow up in the 50s playing ringer, crouching at the circle with my shooter marble and flicking it inside with flourish. But my dad had grown up in that time and in that world, and he had a friend whose father had run a single furnace marble factory near Cairo, and so I started my journey down that road, first by talking to my dad and then just going on. And of course, my journey led me inevitably to the realest marble man I know of, and that was Jim King out of Sistersville. So just as I have acknowledged my ever-important find for researching the Owens glass manufacturing plant in that comb-bound book that's going around right now, I must acknowledge another kind of source, the best kind, a living, breathing human source. I called up Mr. King cold and told him about my book in progress, and he could not have been more kind or gracious. Among other things, he sent me something else I'll send around, and it's a meticulous document outlining every process with illustrations that I had inquired about on the phone, and I am forever grateful to him for doing so. And so, I think I've got that one up here as well. Yes, this says, Glenn, I enjoyed speaking with you last evening. Mary and I look forward to reading your book. Attached is the information I promised. If you have any additional questions or if I may be of any further assistance, please let me know. Have a great day, Jim King. And if any of you know King's Corner in Sistersville, I mean, this is just amazing. You know, like he put this together. Cullet Photo 1, cullet is broken glass that they use to make the marbles. Cullet Photo 2, cullet Photo 3, you know, then he has the insides of the furnace, rear furnace, front furnace. I mean, unbelievable. You know, I went from not knowing a damn thing about marbles and marble making to, you know, having like a detailed illustrated explanation. So special shout out to Jim King. You can peruse this if you like to. And so, you know, I think that just as I read you some of the factory passages, maybe I'll read you a couple of marble passages that resulted from Jim King's generosity. The first one comes early in their attempts at making marbles. So this is June of 1953, before they really knew what the hell they were doing out on this property. These would be test batches. Those are their first batches, their first attempts at making marbles. And this is just one little paragraph. The test batches came out of the furnace ugly colored and easily cracked. Among them, here and there, was a passable marble, enough to fill 50 hand-knitted bags, 25 count in each. They were banded swirl marbles of green and blue, amber and red. Shooters, taws, some called them, were bigger than the rest. Ledford made these by hand, one at a time. And, you know, here I have to stop, and I've already praised Jim King, but I have to show you what he made for me after this book came out. First, you'll note my little pen holder is an old West Virginia license plate. Isn't that cool? 1965, in fact. You know, this one got a hole in it, but that's the normal little Marble King marble bag. Here is a nicer one, you know, a cloth bag full of marbles. You might remember these. And, of course, industrial usage. If you're shaking up a can of spray paint, that marble is most likely made here in West Virginia. Still, to this day, those are glass marbles inside the spray paint can. But I will send this one around. This says, celebrating Glenn Taylor's The Marrowbone Marble Company, J-Bo Vitro Caramel Swirls. And he even put the cover of the book on there, and they're caramel colored, like the cover of, you're seeing the paperback. The hardcover was more of a tan color, so I'll send these around. I just thought that was the greatest thing ever. Special edition marbles. Okay. Maybe just one more little quick one. This would be not so much marble manufacture, but what those marbles were made for, which, you know, Ringer, don't know how many of you are familiar with the game of Ringer, but up the cut, a crowd of children had gathered. They stood around the dirt and plywood platform in silence as the wooden cross rack was lifted from the center. It left behind 13 marbles, 3 inches between them, their lines cutting an X on the well-worn surface. This was the game of Ringer. 2 boys towed the pitch line and knuckled up. The fat one, Hambone Maynard, shot first. His tall quit rolling 2 inches short of the lag line. A couple of girls in the crowd whistled their approval. Then Orb Ledford unleashed his big sulfide shooter, a black-painted dog inside. His unorthodox release caused some to shake their heads, but those heads went still as the marble quit rolling half an inch short of the lag line. Orb knocked 7 out of the circle before Hambone Maynard cleared 1. The game was over quick. It was for keepsies, but when Hambone held out his banded, cleary, tall, Orb nodded no and walked away. His daddy had told him, never rock the boat when it came to Maynard's. And so what you see is kind of like this innocence and this joy of childhood games from the marbles. But even in those games, there's a little hint of impending violence and tension between the boys playing because, one comes from this, what the community around there thinks that Orb is his name. So again, he was named from a dream of Ledford's that told him to name his third-born child Orb, kind of like, like a marble. And so he did. And so one child playing ringer here is like the named strange child of the communal integrated hippies living on the land making marbles, and the other one is a country boy who doesn't want to have anything to do with that stuff. And so you can even in the more innocent child's game parts of the novel, you can start to see some hints of the tension to come. Okay, and as I said, I think we see in this last passage a dark hinting that the dream of a multiracial utopian factory grounds was not going to come to fruition without serious pushback, without more war, this time a different kind of war, the kind we are still fighting in this country, the ongoing struggle for equality and human rights. And that is what the book is truly about. Glass, whether a mass-produced, machine-blown bottle variety, or a handmade or single furnace marble kind meant for children's joy, glass, then, is merely the surface path of a profoundly more important journey, one toward love and tolerance and peace. But as we have learned, we seem only capable of violence on the way to such noble ends. My favorite writer, besides Louise McNeill, is Lucille Clifton, a poet I had the opportunity to meet face-to-face when I was 17 years old and she visited Marshall University to give a reading. That was 1992. Lucille Clifton wrote this: "Let the war be won. Let love be at the end." And I suppose that behind all this glass in the Marrowbone Marble Company, there is that: war, struggle, inevitable violence, but all of it endured with the underlying fundamental hope that there can be love at the end. I mentioned Studs Terkel's book, The Good War, earlier. He is, as I said, another one of my favorites, and another of his books is called Hope Dies Last. I like that. I have painted it on my signboard and carried it in protest rallies. Hope dies last. It signals that as long as we are alive, so will be hope, that they can't take hope from us until they kill us, and West Virginians are not easy to kill. It is this scrappy philosophy at the heart of the book we are talking about today. And so, if we have time, I'm not sure when I'm supposed to stop. Can you all? I might read one more passage if we have time, do we? Oh, we got time. If you're not too bored, I might read to you some more. So, that scrappy philosophy at the heart of the book is kind of really what we're talking about behind all this glass stuff. And so I'll read a little longer passage or two, if we have time, that might interest you. And these passages don't have so much to do with glass, but instead societal struggle. And the first passage I want to read is, again, only possible through more book research, this time on the civil rights movement, along with more of that best kind of research I mentioned earlier, which is listening to the lived experience of another human being. This time, fellow Huntingtonian Michael Gray, who dropped out of West Virginia State to join the civil rights movement, was subsequently drafted and served in Vietnam, but who, before all that, in March of 1965, left West Virginia with some friends and drove south to participate in the Selma to Montgomery March. Mr. Gray's life experience enabled me to write the following, which perhaps is kind of a fitting way to kind of wrap some of this up today, as it captures the aforementioned heart of the book, and it does so through depicting an experience far away from our West Virginia home, our glass factories and marble manufacturer. Because, as I've come to learn, maybe it is only through experiencing other places that we can truly come to know our own. And so the story behind this is that Michael Gray is a bit younger than my father, but he's more my father's generation than mine. And he would have been a student at West Virginia State, which of course at that time was predominantly black, and it's a historical black college in Charleston. And he dropped out of school to join the civil rights movement, and as I said, was subsequently drafted and went to Vietnam. But he kind of enlightened me. He taught law at Ohio University, which is where I went as an undergrad. And so when I was young, he gave me a ride a couple times from Huntington back to Athens and told me what it was like at that time. Told me what it was like when integration happened in Huntington, and he was, suddenly went from having all black teachers in an all black school to being integrated in the public schools, and told me about Vietnam, and told me about what it was like to be a part of this march from Selma to Montgomery. And so combined with some book research, I was able to come up with this. And I thought I'd just read you a short passage. Get out of West Virginia for a minute, and here the three characters are Staples, who's an older preacher from the passage that Mark read to you, kind of a progressive preacher on the grounds of the Marrowbone Marble Company. And then there's Harold, who is Mac Wells's son, and Mary, who is Loyal Ledford's son. And the three of them have gone down. They spent one night in Chattanooga, and then they kept on going, and they arrived in Selma, and they marched. And now they're spending the night on the grounds of St. Jude's, which was what people did, in the partway through that march. The city of St. Jude was God's domain, a campsite for those who descended upon Montgomery to do his work. As dusk fell, Mary pointed her camera to the sky, where a helicopter droned and circled before doubling back. "Why does it keep flying over?" she asked. Harold wiped his hands on his blue jeans. The tent pole was repaired. "Looking for snipers," he said. All around were Army troops and Alabama guardsmen. Mary filmed their helmets and rifle tips, so cold and dull, dancing above the heads of nuns and schoolchildren and men and women from north and south and in between. White and black were together in her viewfinder. They were jammed on the lawn like sardines. They passed sandwiches hand over hand. The setting sun glinted off the foil wrapping, and Mary's lens filled with white light. She filmed a U.S. Marshal standing out front of women's tent number 4, his senses trained to know an assassin. Dr. King's convoy of black sedans had been hurried through a gate and back. The sun set over the red brick St. Jude's spire. Darkness set in. Folks in the crowd spoke on numbers. They'd heard they were 10,000 strong. By 9 o'clock, it had gotten cold, and the mud in the field sent shivers through ankle bones. Everyone waited before a big flatbed truck. Celebrities were to appear there. Their songs and jokes and words of wisdom had been promised. Behind Staples, a man asked, "Did I hear right? Is Tony Bennett here?" Harold had his eye out for Nina Simone. He hoped she'd sing the song Mississippi Goddam. Morning came quick, and as the march filed out of St. Jude's, Mary, Harold, and Staples found themselves in the middle of a pack that stretched before and behind them for miles. The clouds broke up, and the sun warmed their bones. Beside them, a young black man carried an enormous American flag atop the wind-bent arc of a tree limb. He led them all in a chorus of onward Christian soldiers. Helicopters flew over twice, and the chopping of the blades nearly drowned out their voices. They sang louder. Among them were a myriad of nuns and men in clerical collars. Staples walked straight back. His shoes had dried. He nodded to a priest. "Peace be with you," he said. Soldiers dotted the highway. They donned helmets and leaned against the hoods of their jeeps. Rifle straps lined their shoulders. They wore looks of disinterest, their faces revealing nothing, as if they watched a parade of 30,000 every day. Fields of dry stickweed lined one side of the highway, and spectators looked on through sunglasses. Some stood and some sat. One man slept with his arm over his head. Another crouched low and filmed the procession, at one point aiming his camera at Mary, who aimed hers back at him. They waved. As they came into Montgomery, the fields turned to houses and filling stations. Black folks stood in packs at the roadside and watched. They waved and sang "This Little Light of Mine" in time with the marchers and clapped. Some had to wipe at their eyes. A woman in a white rain scarf raised her arms above her head and wept at a sight she could scarcely believe possible. The clouds bunched up and a drizzle let down. As they turned onto Oak Street and narrowed their column, people stood in front of their clapboard homes and waved endlessly. Stoops were broken down. Every other porch board was missing. Homes sagged on their block foundations, and tiny faces peeked from broken window panes stuffed with rags. Staples was reminded of the homes around Marrowbone. The children possessed the same knowing eye. In the business district, no one was there to watch them. They could hear the Star-Spangled Banner, though they were still blocks from the Capitol. Here and there, white women in fitted skirts began to appear on city sidewalks. They watched and talked while their husbands stood in suits and smoked cigars and tried to keep their customary smirks in the face of all that change. On Dexter Street, Mary trained her camera on the far-off stage, where Rosa Parks had just stepped out to a roaring ovation. When she spoke of hiding from the Klan as a girl, Mary ran out of film. She lowered her camera. Only then did she feel the weight of where she was. Harold looked all around, past the guardsmen and the plywood barriers lining the wide street. He looked in the windows of the office supply company and the big bank building. Now all the faces were white. On the balcony of the Jefferson Davis Hotel, the white men gathered. Some slumped on the rail and some stood tall. None wore his customary smirk, and Harold beheld in them the opened-mouth realization that a new day had truly come. "This is it," he said to himself, a whisper among the masses. Like everyone else, the three of them locked arms, and like everyone else, they roared when Martin Luther King Jr. took the stage and declared that segregation was on its deathbed in Alabama. Staples nearly broke down listening to the man. It was as if King were a prophet sent straight from God. As television cameras rolled, he stood and gave a history lesson to the country. He told of how those in power had engineered Jim Crow to keep poor whites separate from poor blacks. He reached back and drew a line from slavery to the very place they stood. "We are on the move now," he said. Time fell away for Staples. He could have listened for 1,000 years. The people raised their voices in glory hallelujah again and again, and the three who had driven from West Virginia vowed to carry back with them what they now possessed. As they filed away from the white columns of the Capitol, a voice came over the loudspeaker. The voice said, "Stragglers must not remain." Hurried travel was now in order, for it was true that to be caught in Alabama after dark was death. And so that's a little taste of what I was talking about. As I said, the book goes all the way from 1941 to 1968. And so as my last very short little passage, I thought I would read you something from quite near the very end of the book, which might wrap all of this crazy, wild, divergent material up a little bit for you. And a reason I say that is because we are December 1968 at this point, and so if you kind of think back to that time, we've got the moon landing, and so the people of Marrowbone Cut are all gathered in like the living room at this point. Some of these folks, like the Bonecutter brothers, old men, have never seen a television. They've just gotten a television out there, and so you can imagine what they have on TV the night of this moon landing, and so. This is a scene in which the people gather to look at a very different kind of glass, a TV screen, something we look at every few minutes or so these days in the form of our phones. If you think about it, that's just glass. That's just a piece of glass in our hand. And so I'll end with this. This is December 1968. The old Ringer circle was gathering dust. Inside it, Harold danced with his mother. He dipped her, and then halfway through the song, he hugged her and walked away toward the tree. Mary watched him come, and when he asked if she cared to dance, she answered, "I'd be delighted." They stepped to the circle, and she lay her head against his chest, and together they swayed slow, though the song was fast. When it was quiet again, the door opened, and Bob Staples came in carrying a store-bought fruit cake. "What are you people doing?" he called. "Turn on the damn television." Jerry pulled the knob and sat on the floor. Orb sat next to him. On the screen was a gray-white curve of light, a voice spoke the words, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the water. Dimple and Wimpy walked over from the door. They'd never looked at a television before. "What is that?" Wimpy asked. Bob Staples said, "It's the surface of the moon." Wimpy shook his head to be sure he wasn't dreaming. "Good Lord in heaven," he whispered. The remaining people of Marrowbone gathered in front of the television and stared at the horizon of the moon. Ledford knew for certain that he would leave the big RCA behind. He would never turn on a television again. The broadcast of the Apollo 8 astronauts would be the last thing he ever watched. They read from Genesis as they orbited. "Merry Christmas," one of them said. "God bless all of you on the good earth." Thank you all. Looks like I've taken us right up to 5 till.
If anybody has any questions, raise your hand. I'll come to you.
Just a comment.
Here, hold on.
Okay. The business that Marble King had was is still in Payton City, Ohio, West Virginia. I apologize. But if you go down there now, it's just a shell of itself. Most of the marbles are being produced overseas now,
Is that right?
so I'm told. But you can still see some stuff in the ground.
Yeah. I wondered about that. I had heard from someone that, when you shake the spray paint can, it's still a marble manufactured in Payton City, but that might not be true anymore, huh? Most likely, as you said, it could very well be manufactured.
Still use some things there, but not what it used to be.
Right. There is a scene in the book that takes place at Marble King on the grounds when it was, going strong, not like it is now.
Anybody else have a question?
Oh, one more shout out while anybody's thinking if they have a question. I got here a little bit early and I went to Mugshots Coffee Shop. Do you all know this place? They made a hell of a good cortado there. Great coffee shop, extremely nice people. And they turned me on to this magazine, YNST, with this incredible piece of artwork on the front that recalls Battle of Blair Mountain, Hawks Nest Tunnel, all kinds of old mining history, and it's filled with artwork and articles by West Virginians, and so I thought I would shout out both Mugshots and YNST. You can always pick up so much good stuff if you just go to a coffee shop in your town you're visiting. Did I miss somebody?
No, I just wanted to tell you, my marbles, which many came from the marble factory, are in ball jars and made into lamps
Oh, that's a great idea.
for vanities. So I
Does
have...
the light shine down into the...
Not necessarily, no, your bulb is upward. But anyhow,
bit.
it's a good way, yeah.
Does it look a little bit like that?
That's literally what we've done.
Okay, yeah, I love it.
So, yeah.
That's a
No,
great idea.
We did 2 of them. I had enough for 2. And so...
Did you make the lamp yourself?
We put them together. There was a man at the time had an antique shop who recommended that you do this. So he had the tops and he had put the socket. He had drilled the hole to put the socket in. And so, I have vanity lamps with... I'm an antique lover, so anyway, it fits.
It does, and I think that's great. A student gave me this, I was their thesis advisor, and they were like, I saw this in an antique shop and thought of you, So I get a lot of marbles.
What is the story on this piece of glass that you have here on the table?
Thank you. I keep forgetting all these things. You ready? I think it's a chip bowl, and then I take it Yeah, it's a 10-gallon hat. If you look closely, you turn it this way. It's got a little band. Yeah, it really is just for serving like chips in, but. Yeah. It was a wedding gift. When my wife and I got married in 1999, our good friend Adrian Garmastani got us this, and you can see the little Blinko sticker on it. So, being from Huntington, we really have a lot of Blinko glass. I wanted to bring a few others. We have that really bold, deep blue picture that's so nice. Yeah, the cobalt blue, exactly. Love that color. But I thought I'd just bring this one. That's probably the most unique piece. We never use it. It's just on display, because who could ever put like French onion dip in this thing?
One last question. Hold on, Marion.
I did not bring any books. I'm sorry. I should have thought of that. But you're at a library. You could probably check one out for free. But if you would like to... But I would never complain if you wanted to go out and buy one either. I probably would have. I should have thought of that. Well, I didn't want to be presumptuous. But that said, great question. And if you leave here and you want to go get online and buy a bunch of my books, go for it. Thank you all
What's
so much.
the best place to buy your books?
You know, there's this thing where if you don't want to, yeah, they're all on Amazon, of course, and if you have Amazon Prime, you get that free shipping. That's the cheapest route to go. But a lot of people, have noticed that this bookshop.org, the bookshop, it's maybe $2 more expensive per book, but something like 13% of each of your purchases on there goes toward local bookstores, not big box stores or big international conglomerations. And so, for instance, on my bookshop.org account, any book I buy, the proceeds go specifically to Taylor Books in Charleston. So you can even pick what bookstore your little extra. So if you got a little extra dough and you want to get on bookshop.org and you don't feel like going to a bookstore, brick and mortar bookstore, and ordering it because they probably won't have many of my books on the shelf, then do it that way. Or just get on Amazon and do it that way, save a couple bucks. I'm not going to judge you.
Repeat the name of your book.
This one's my second novel, so it's the Marrowbone Marble Company. Kind of inspired by what a lot of people call Marrowbone, down where my dad's from in Mingo County. My first one is The Ballad of Trenchmouth Taggart, if you just remember Trenchmouth. And then there was A Hanging at Cinder Bottom. These are all such long titles. But if you find one, you'll find them all. And then my most recent, Mark mentioned, The Songs of Betty Bache. And then I'm finishing my fifth novel right now. So fingers crossed. Yeah. That one is called 10 Mile Benny. Benny, B-E-N-N-Y. So yeah, the last one was Betty, and this one's Benny. So they're all set in West Virginia. They always will be. And they all have an epigraph by Louise McNeil, another of our incredible poet laureates. Thank you all so much for having me.